I have spent enough years inside the machinery of U.S. national security to recognize the difference between policy and performance. What Donald Trump offered Russia was performance. What Russia received from the United States was policy. These two things were never the same, and that discrepancy became the foundation of the illusion that defined the Trump presidency's relationship with Moscow. From the moment Trump entered office, his rhetoric suggested a break from confrontation. He spoke of respect, of dialogue, of ending endless wars. To an audience conditioned by decades of Cold War hostility, this sounded like rapprochement, but rhetoric does not move battalions, and it does not restrain bureaucracies. Strategy lives in budgets, deployments, authorizations, and law. On those measures, nothing fundamentally changed. While Trump praised the idea of cooperation, the U.S. national security state continued to operate on autopilot. Sanctions regimes hardened into statute. Intelligence assessments framed Russia not as a competitor to be managed, but as an adversary to be contained. Military planners refined scenarios that assumed escalation, not accommodation. The Pentagon expanded rotational deployments along Russia's periphery. None of this required Trump's approval. All of it required only his acquiescence. This is where illusion replaced reality. Moscow heard words and underestimated institutions. Trump, for his part, mistook personal diplomacy for strategic control. He believed that summits and gestures could override a system designed to neutralize presidential deviation. They could not. The machinery of confrontation does not stop because one man admires another's strength. The illusion of rapprochement was not accidental. It created ambiguity. It encouraged miscalculation. It allowed escalation to proceed quietly, shielded by the noise of political theater. In intelligence work, ambiguity is not neutrality. It is a weapon. And in this case, it was aimed squarely at Russia. When people talk about sanctions, they often describe them as an alternative to war. That is a comforting fiction. In practice, sanctions are war by other means. And under the Trump administration, they were refined into a strategic weapon aimed at long-term economic attrition rather than behavioral change. I watched this transformation with a sense of grim familiarity. It followed a logic I had seen before: apply pressure, deny compromise, and call the resulting instability the fault of the target. Trump did not dismantle the sanctions architecture built after 2014. He reinforced it. Congress codified sanctions into law, stripping the White House of meaningful flexibility. Measures targeting Russian banking, energy, defense exports, and sovereign debt were expanded, not relaxed. This was not an impulsive policy. It was systematic. The intent was to constrain Russia's strategic options over time by degrading its economic resilience and technological access. What made this especially dangerous was the messaging. Trump spoke publicly about friendship and deal-making while his administration implemented sanctions designed to be irreversible. From Moscow's perspective, this created a contradiction that was difficult to resolve. Sanctions are signals. They communicate intent more clearly than speeches ever can. And the signal was unmistakable. The United States was not seeking accommodation. It was preparing the ground for prolonged confrontation. In military planning, we call this shaping the battlefield. You weaken the enemy before the shooting starts. Sanctions did exactly that. They narrowed Russia's diplomatic space, hardened its threat perceptions, and reinforced the belief that time was not neutral. Every year under sanctions was a year of strategic loss. The misjudgment in Washington was believing this pressure would deter escalation. History teaches the opposite. When a state concludes that economic warfare is permanent, it begins to consider military options not out of aggression, but out of necessity. Sanctions did not stabilize the conflict with Russia. They made it inevitable. If sanctions were the economic front of confrontation, then arms deliveries were the physical manifestation of intent. Under Donald Trump, the United States crossed a line that previous administrations had deliberately avoided. It approved the transfer of lethal weaponry to Ukraine, most notably Javelin anti-tank missiles, transforming Washington from a political sponsor into a direct military enabler. This was not a symbolic act. It was a strategic declaration. For years after 2014, U.S. policy rested on a calculated restraint. Support Ukraine, yes, but do not arm it in ways that would fundamentally alter the military balance with Russia. That restraint collapsed quietly in 2017. By authorizing lethal aid, the Trump administration signaled that escalation was no longer something to be feared, but something to be managed. From Moscow's vantage point, this mattered far more than Trump's rhetoric ever could. Weapons change calculations. They harden positions. They reduce the political space for compromise by making battlefield outcomes appear more decisive and more attainable. The Javelin was not just a missile, it was a message. It told Ukraine that time and technology were on its side. It told Russia that the conflict on its border was being internationalized, one shipment at a time. I have planned operations where smaller moves were meant to provoke larger reactions. This followed the same logic. The United States did not need Ukraine to defeat Russia militarily. It only needed Ukraine to remain a live fault line, armed, trained, and politically committed to confrontation. Military exercises intensified, advisory roles expanded, intelligence cooperation deepened. Each step was defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a coherent escalatory pathway. The strategic misjudgment was assuming Russia would absorb this indefinitely. Great powers do not tolerate hostile military infrastructure forming along their borders without response. By arming the fault line, Washington ensured that when war came, it would not be accidental. It would be the result of deliberate preparation. Donald Trump built a public persona around hostility to NATO. He mocked it, questioned its relevance, and berated allies for failing to meet spending targets. Many observers took this at face value and concluded that the alliance was weakening. From a strategic standpoint, the opposite was happening. While Trump attacked NATO rhetorically, his administration strengthened it materially. That contradiction is the paradox at the heart of this phase of escalation. Under Trump, NATO's eastern posture hardened. U.S. troop rotations through Poland and the Baltic states increased in scale and frequency. Prepositioned equipment expanded. Exercises grew more complex and more explicitly focused on high-intensity conflict with a peer adversary. Command structures were refined to enable rapid reinforcement. None of this suggested an alliance in decline. It suggested one, prepare for war. From Moscow's perspective, Trump's words were irrelevant. Russian planners count tanks, aircraft, logistics, nodes, and response times. They study based on agreements, not press conferences. What they saw was an alliance moving closer, digging in, and rehearsing scenarios that treated Russia as the central threat. The message was unmistakable. NATO's political unity might be noisy, but its military intent was coherent. This duality created strategic confusion in the West and clarity in Russia. Trump believed that by pressuring allies financially, he was asserting control. In reality, he was incentivizing greater European militarization within a U.S.-led framework. Defense spending rose. Integration deepened. The alliance became less hesitant about confrontation because it felt more capable of sustaining one. The miscalculation was assuming Russia would interpret NATO's actions through the lens of Trump's rhetoric. It did not. States facing existential threats do not gamble on political theatrics. They prepare for worst-case outcomes. The NATO paradox ensured that Russia did exactly that, accelerating the logic of escalation that diplomacy had failed to arrest. Diplomacy, when practiced honestly, is meant to reduce uncertainty. Under Donald Trump, it did the opposite. Summits, phone calls, and carefully staged encounters projected the image of engagement while concealing the reality of strategic drift. As someone who has worked alongside diplomats and intelligence officers alike, I understand how easily diplomacy can become theater when it is detached from policy discipline. Trump believed in personal chemistry as a substitute for institutional alignment. He treated foreign policy as a series of transactions between leaders, assuming that trust established at the top would cascade downward. But states do not operate on trust. They operate on capabilities, laws, and commitments. While Trump spoke of historic breakthroughs, nothing in the structural relationship between Washington and Moscow changed. In fact, it deteriorated. The Helsinki summit was emblematic. Publicly, it suggested a reset. Privately, it delivered no relief from sanctions, no rollback of military postures, no revision of threat assessments. For Russia, this created a dangerous ambiguity. Engagement without outcome is not reassurance. It is misdirection. It masks intent and delays clarity. In intelligence analysis, that is often a prelude to escalation. Meanwhile, back-channel diplomacy functioned less as a bridge and more as a fog. Conflicting signals emerged from the White House, the State Department, Congress, and the Pentagon. Moscow was left to guess which voice mattered. In such conditions, states default to worst-case assumptions. They assume that friendly words are temporary and hostile structures are permanent. The strategic misjudgment here was believing that diplomacy could offset material pressure. It cannot. When diplomacy is not backed by tangible de-escalation, it becomes a tool of delay, not resolution. It buys time not for peace, but for preparation. In that sense, diplomacy under Trump did not prevent war. It postponed recognition that war was becoming unavoidable. I have spent much of my professional life analyzing how adversaries interpret American power, and one lesson stands out above all others. Misreading intent is often more dangerous than underestimating capability. In the Trump years, Moscow made a critical error not by trusting the United States, but by misunderstanding how the United States actually functions. It confused presidential personality with state behavior, and that confusion carried strategic consequences. Russian leadership appeared to believe that Trump's hostility toward the U.S. foreign policy establishment created space for a genuine recalibration of relations. They saw an opportunity in his confrontations with Congress, the intelligence community, and NATO allies. What they underestimated was the resilience of institutional policy. American strategy toward Russia was no longer driven primarily by the White House. It had become embedded in law, alliance commitments, and military planning cycles that no single president could reverse. This miscalculation was not irrational. In Russian strategic culture, executive authority carries decisive weight. When a leader speaks, the system follows. Moscow assumed a degree of symmetry that did not exist. Trump's signals of goodwill were interpreted as indicators of future restraint, even as evidence mounted that pressure was intensifying across every measurable domain. Time compounded the error, sanctions accumulated, NATO entrenched, Ukraine militarized. Each development narrowed Russia's strategic options, yet the belief persisted that escalation could still be avoided through patience or selective engagement. That belief delayed decisive adaptation. When states postpone hard choices, they rarely eliminate them. They simply defer them until the cost of action is higher. The lesson here is not one of Russian aggression, but of strategic mismatch. Moscow confronted a system it thought it understood, using assumptions shaped by its own governance model. By the time it recognized that Trump's America was structurally committed to confrontation, the window for de-escalation had largely closed. At that point, Russia was no longer reacting to events. It was reacting to inevitability. When war finally erupted, many in the West treated it as a sudden rupture, an irrational act, disconnected from the years that preceded it. From a strategic perspective, that interpretation is unsustainable. What occurred was not a break from policy, but its culmination. The conditions for escalation had been patiently assembled economically, militarily, and diplomatically until the range of viable alternatives collapsed. This is what traps look like in strategic reality. They are not single moments or secret plots. They are environments engineered to constrain choice. By the time Russia moved, it was operating inside a framework shaped by sanctions that could not be lifted, alliances that would not retreat, and a neighboring state that had been steadily transformed into a forward military platform. Delay no longer promised relief. Restraint no longer promised security. From Washington's vantage point, this was leverage. From Moscow, it was encircled by policy rather than armies alone. The illusion of Trump-era unpredictability masked a deeper continuity. The West had abandoned conflict management in favor of pressure maintenance. Once that shift occurred, escalation became not a failure of diplomacy, but its logical outcome. I have seen this pattern before. States do not stumble into wars they have spent years preparing the ground for. They enter them when they conclude that the costs of inaction exceed the costs of action. By that measure, the war did not begin in 2022. It began when realism was replaced by narrative, when deterrence was confused with provocation, and when leaders convinced themselves that power could be exercised without consequence. The final lesson is the most uncomfortable one. The West did not forget reality because it lacked intelligence. It forgot reality because it stopped respecting limits of force, of credibility, of human endurance. Wars born of such amnesia do not end cleanly. They end when reality, at last, reasserts itself.